On a bleak winter morning in the suburbs, an 18-year-old cashier met an elderly widow buying 4 items but short by 85 cents. Behind her, impatient customers crowded in, their anxious eyes heavy with judgment. He quietly took out his wallet, covered the shortage, and handed her the can of soup. Suddenly, people in line began paying for one another, turning the tension into a wave of kindness that spread through the store and changed their lives forever. The air that morning carried a damp chill, the kind that crept under coats and lingered in the bones. Outside, late January's snow had melted into patchy, grimy slush, pooling in uneven puddles that reflected the dull gray of a sky unwilling to clear. The automatic doors of Maple and Company groaned as they slid open, letting in a draft of cold air that swirled around the small aisles lined with neatly stocked shelves. The bell above the entrance gave its tired chime, and Marcus Johnson glanced up from his register. It was 10:30 a.m., the quiet stretch before the midday rush, and he liked this time, when the store wasn't yet loud, when he could hear the low hum of the refrigerators and the faint shuffle of carts across the worn linoleum. Marcus, 18, stood straight behind the counter, scanning items for a young mother ahead of the line. His uniform, a faded green apron over a black hoodie, fit snugly across his shoulders. His eyes were warm but reserved, his movements measured. He was a quiet presence in the store, the kind customers remembered not for what he said, but for how he made them feel acknowledged. Every shift he clocked in on time, his phone tucked away, his mind on the work and on the bills waiting back home. Home meant a small second-floor apartment, 3 bus stops away, where his grandmother, Lorraine Johnson, kept the heat low to save on the electric bill. She had raised him since he was 9, after his mother's sudden passing and his father's absence became permanent. Marcus had grown into the kind of young man who understood responsibility not as a choice, but as the air he breathed. Helping cover the utility bills, picking up his grandmother's prescriptions, cooking simple dinners, these were his normal. The young mother paid, gathered her grocery bags, and left. Marcus reached for the next customer. Margaret Thompson moved toward the counter with deliberate, careful steps. Her wool coat hung a little loose on her frame, and the faint scent of lavender and old paper followed her. A knitted hat, pale blue and frayed at the edges, sat slightly askew on her white hair. She set a small wire basket on the conveyor belt with hands that trembled just enough to make the items inside clink softly. Marcus offered his standard greeting. "Good morning, ma'am. Staying warm out there?" His voice carried a natural gentleness, one that made even strangers feel safe answering. Margaret's pale eyes lifted to meet his, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Trying to," she said, her tone a mix of wariness and politeness. She placed her items on the belt, 1 loaf of wheat bread, a quart of milk, a small pack of butter, and a single can of chicken noodle soup. The arrangement looked careful, almost ceremonial, as if each item had been considered before being chosen. Marcus began scanning them, the familiar beeps punctuating the quiet space. The total flashed on the small display, $6.12. He glanced at Margaret, expecting her to pull out a wallet. Instead, she reached into her oversized purse and drew out a small cloth pouch, faded with age. She placed it on the counter and untied the drawstring with slow, deliberate fingers. Out spilled a handful of coins, quarters, dimes, nickels, and a scattering of pennies, along with 3 worn $1 bills folded neatly but creased from years of use. Marcus noticed the way her hands hesitated, the faint stiffness in her fingers, as she began to count. She spoke softly under her breath, naming each amount as if to steady herself. He stood still, watching her work through the pile. Something in him recognized the ritual, the careful stretch of every cent. He thought of the small jar on his grandmother's counter where loose change collected until there was enough for bus fare or a bag of rice. Margaret counted once. Then again. She pushed the coins into neat stacks, her breath visible in the cold draft from the nearby door. Finally, she looked up at Marcus, her expression a mix of apology and resignation. "I'm 85 cents short," she said quietly, almost as if admitting something shameful. Before Marcus could respond, a noise broke the moment. The man behind her, a broad-shouldered figure in a heavy parka, began tapping his fingers against the counter in a steady, impatient rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharp, louder than it should have been, filling the space between them. Margaret's shoulders tightened. She glanced over her shoulder briefly, then back to Marcus. Her eyes dropped to the can of soup, the last item on the belt. Maybe we can put this one back," she murmured, her voice fading under the weight of the room's attention. Marcus felt the shift in the air, the subtle tension, the way the other customers adjusted their stances, some pretending not to watch, others openly curious. In his chest, something tightened. He could see the way her fingers lingered on the can, not ready to let go, and the quiet plea hidden in her voice even though she hadn't asked for help. The register screen still glowed $6.12. The man's tapping grew a little faster. Somewhere near the entrance, a cart wheel squeaked against the floor. Marcus realized that everyone was waiting for something, waiting to move on, waiting for her to decide what she could afford to give up. He didn't move yet, but his mind was already turning, weighing the scene in front of him, like a scale tipped just slightly toward a choice he hadn't made out loud. And in that moment, with the cold air still drifting in from the street, and the faint smell of coffee from the break room behind him, Marcus knew this wasn't just another transaction. This was the kind of moment that could pass in silence, or change the way someone carried their day. He didn't take his eyes off Margaret, and she didn't take hers off the can of soup. The distance between them was only the width of the counter, but it held an entire conversation neither of them had spoken yet. Margaret's voice trembled as she looked down at the can of soup resting on the counter, her fingers brushing the label as if it were something fragile. "Maybe you can just take this one off for me, dear. I'll come back for it, another time," she said softly, the words carrying more than just the weight of the missing 85 cents. There was a pause, just long enough for the sound of a deep sigh to escape from a woman in line, the kind of sigh that made it clear she thought the morning had already been delayed too long. A young man leaning against his cart gave a small shake of his head, the impatient twitch in his jaw suggesting he had somewhere else to be. The tapping fingers of the man in the heavy parka had stopped, but now the silence in the line felt sharper, like the air just before a storm. Marcus kept his eyes on Margaret, noticing the way her shoulders had curled inward, the way her lips pressed together as though she were trying to make herself smaller, to disappear from the moment. He could almost see the decades in her posture, years of giving without asking, of doing without so others could have. That thought tightened something deep in his chest. He glanced at the can again, its bright red label standing out against the dull tones of the counter, and then his gaze shifted to her purse, the small cloth pouch still lying open with the few coins left inside. The decision rose in him before he even realized he'd made it. He hesitated for just a breath, enough to feel the room still watching, then reached into the pocket of his apron and pulled out his worn leather wallet. He opened it, thumbed past a few crumpled bills, and slid out a single dollar. Without a word at first, he set it on the counter, the soft slap of the paper breaking the tension like the first drop of rain on a still pond. He picked up the can of soup and scanned it with the same steady hand he used for every customer, the beep sounding louder than it should have. "This one's on me, ma'am," he said, his tone calm, free of any flourish or show. "Consider it a gift." He kept his focus on the register, not seeking thanks, just finishing the transaction as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Margaret's eyes widened, a flicker of confusion passing before they softened with recognition. "Oh no, I can't let you," she began, but her voice caught in her throat. Her hands fluttered for a moment, unsure whether to push the dollar back toward him or to hold on to the bag that was slowly filling with her groceries. Marcus lifted his eyes to hers and gave a small reassuring smile, the kind that carried quiet certainty. "You used to read to us at the library, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low enough that it felt like a conversation just between them, even though every ear in line was listening now. "I remember, you sat in the corner by the big window, reading those mystery stories. We'd all crowd around and listen." He saw the recognition spark in her eyes, the faintest ghost of that part of her life returning to her face. "Today," he continued gently, "it's my turn to give something back." Margaret's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, her eyes brimmed with tears that she blinked away quickly, as though afraid they might spill over in front of strangers. The sigh from the woman in line had vanished. The young man who'd been shaking his head now stood still, his gaze fixed on the counter. Even the man in the parka had stopped shifting his weight. The restless energy that had filled the space a moment ago was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt almost sacred, like the hush that falls in a church before a hymn begins. Marcus handed Margaret her bag, his fingers brushing hers for just an instant. It was enough for her to feel the warmth in his touch, the sincerity in the simple gesture. He turned back to the register, moving on to close the sale, but the moment lingered in the air, held in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed it. No one spoke, no one seemed in a hurry anymore. It was as if the room itself had exhaled, the tension dissolving into something softer, something rare. The can of soup was now tucked safely in Margaret's bag, but the real transaction had already happened, in a currency that couldn't be measured on the glowing numbers of the register. For a moment after Margaret took the bag from Marcus, the air felt almost still, as if the entire line had paused to hold the memory in place. Her hands clutched the strap as though anchoring herself to something solid. She opened her mouth once, twice, as if to speak, but nothing came except a small nod. Marcus gave a respectful dip of his head and turned back toward the register, ready to scan the next customer's items. That was when the woman directly behind Margaret stepped forward, a middle-aged lady in a maroon winter coat with snow still melting from the hood. She had been silent up to now, but her voice came out clear and sure. "I'd like to pay for the next 2 people behind me," she said, already reaching for her wallet. The words landed with the kind of surprise that makes people straighten in their place. Marcus looked up, not quite certain he had heard her right, but the woman gave him a steady no-nonsense look, the kind a person uses when they have already decided, and won't be swayed. Margaret froze, half turned toward her, eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. The woman placed her card on the counter with a quiet finality, and Marcus felt something shift, something subtle but unmistakable, like a door opening to a room no one had noticed was there. Before he could process the gesture, a voice rose from the next lane over. A tall man with broad shoulders and a salt and pepper beard leaned on his cart, peering over the low divider. His coat looked too small for him, sleeves riding high as he raised a hand. "Go ahead and put me down for 5 people after that," he called out, his tone warm, almost cheerful, as though he were offering to buy a round of drinks for strangers at a bar. He reached for his wallet, the leather worn soft from years of use, and waved it casually, already stepping closer to make it easier for Marcus to take his card. Marcus blinked. In the span of 20 seconds, what had been a quiet, slightly tense grocery line was becoming something entirely different. He glanced at Margaret, who stood rooted in place, her bag hanging from her arm, her mouth slightly open. There was color in her cheeks now, and her grip on the strap had loosened. Then from a few places back in the line, a younger man in a black beanie pulled a phone from his pocket. "Hey man, you take Cash App or Venmo?" he asked, already unlocking the screen. His eyes were bright with the energy of the moment, the kind of light that comes when people feel part of something unusual and good. Marcus hesitated a beat, then gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said. The man's thumbs moved quickly, and a few seconds later, Marcus felt the faint buzz of a payment notification in his own pocket. It was as if those few offers had broken a seal. A woman in a nurse's uniform at the far end of the aisle raised her hand. "I'll cover the person ahead of me." A man in a baseball cap behind her called out, "Count me in for the next 3. Someone else added, "Let's keep it going." The line, once a collection of strangers standing in their own separate bubbles, was now alive with movement and quiet conversation. People began smiling at one another, leaning forward to see who was paying for whom. Within less than a minute, the ripple had spread beyond Marcus's lane. At the other 2 checkout counters, customers were turning toward each other with offers. "I've got yours," one man said, tapping a woman lightly on the shoulder. No, let me do it for you," another replied with a grin. The cashiers, 2 young women Marcus knew from school, looked up from their registers, exchanging glances that said, "Is this really happening?" The atmosphere in the store transformed in a way Marcus had never seen. Where there had been sighs and shuffling feet, there was now a low hum of excitement, like the murmur before a concert begins. The impatient tapping of the man in the parka had stopped entirely. He now stood with his hands in his pockets, smiling faintly as he watched the exchanges happen. A soft laugh broke out near the produce section, where an older gentleman was telling a story to a woman he had just met, because he had paid for her apples and bread. Another customer reached across a cart to shake hands with the person they had just covered. There was no announcement, no official coordination, just a quiet understanding passing between strangers, a thread of goodwill weaving its way through the store. Marcus felt his chest tighten in a different way now, not from the tension earlier, but from the sudden overwhelming sense that something rare was unfolding right in front of him. His hands kept moving, scanning items, bagging groceries, handing receipts, but his mind was half anchored to the scene around him. He caught sight of Margaret still standing off to the side, watching the line as if she were witnessing a story being written in real time. Her eyes glistened, and every so often she would press her lips together as if to keep from crying. Unnoticed by most, a man in a dark green jacket had his phone out, holding it low near his chest. He wasn't broadcasting live, wasn't speaking into it, just quietly recording the scene in short bursts. Every now and then he would tilt the phone slightly, capturing the handshakes, the laughter, the way people's faces softened as they accepted or offered help. It didn't feel intrusive. If anything, it seemed like he was trying to preserve something, to have proof later that this had really happened. Marcus handed a bag to the woman who had first offered to pay for 2 people and thanked her quietly. She gave him a small smile in return, and stepped aside, letting the next customer forward. The line moved, but it no longer had the impatient rhythm of earlier. Now each transaction carried a small moment of connection, someone offering, someone receiving, a thank you spoken, a smile exchanged. He could feel the warmth of it settling into the air, as though the cold from outside had been pushed out by something more human than the store's heating system could ever provide. It wasn't loud, not in the way a celebration is loud, but it was full of glances, gestures, quiet laughter. For Marcus, the surreal part wasn't that people were paying for each other, it was how quickly the mood had turned, how easily strangers had decided to join in without hesitation, as if they'd all been waiting for an excuse to show the better parts of themselves. He glanced at the man in the green jacket, who now tucked his phone away with a satisfied nod, like a craftsman closing his toolbox after a job well done. The groceries kept moving down the belt, the receipts kept printing, but Marcus knew something was different now. People lingered a little longer at the counter after their turn, as if reluctant to let the moment go. They were no longer just customers in line at Maple & Company on a gray January morning. They were part of something shared, something worth remembering. And though he didn't know it yet, the story of what had just happened would not stay inside the walls of the little grocery store for long. 3 days after that gray January morning, the grocery store felt almost back to normal, carts rolling over the same scuffed linoleum, the steady beep of scanners, the low hum of conversation between cashiers and customers. But something had shifted, even if Marcus couldn't quite name it. He noticed it in the way people greeted each other in line, a little warmer, a little more patient, as if the echo of that morning's generosity still lingered in the walls. He didn't expect to hear much more about it, but the moment had already taken on a life of its own. On a cold Friday evening, Marcus was on the couch at home, scrolling through his phone after dinner. His grandmother was in the kitchen rinsing dishes, humming a hymn under her breath. A notification popped up. A friend from school had tagged him in a community Facebook post. Marcus tapped it open, and there it was, a short video clip of his checkout lane, recorded from the side, showing him slipping the dollar onto the counter, Margaret's surprised face, and then the first woman offering to pay for others. The clip was only a minute long, but it captured everything: the quiet moment, the ripple of generosity, the soft laughter near the end. The caption read, "This is why I love Detroit. Kindness is alive." By the next morning, the video had been shared hundreds of times in the local community group. Neighbors were tagging each other in the comments, swapping stories of small kindnesses they'd seen or given. On Sunday afternoon, a producer from a Detroit news station messaged the page asking for permission to use the clip. By Monday evening, Marcus was watching the 6 o'clock news with his grandmother, and there he was, blurred in the background of a shot, bagging groceries while the anchor spoke about a simple act of generosity that sparked an entire store to join in. The store manager, a stout man named Mr. Collins, came over to Marcus the next day holding a business card from a local radio station. "They want to interview you," he said, looking almost proud. Marcus shook his head politely. "I appreciate it, but no thank you," he said. "I'm not looking for attention." Mr. Collins frowned, but Marcus only added, "My grandmother always told me, if you can help someone, help them right away." That's all this was, nothing more. Meanwhile, Margaret began receiving envelopes in her mailbox, some addressed in careful cursive, others typed neatly on white labels. Inside were handwritten cards from people she had never met, telling her how much her story had touched them. A few contained grocery store gift cards. One had a note from a family in Ohio who promised to pray for her health every week. She called Marcus's manager one afternoon just to say thank you for hiring a young man with such a good heart. The attention faded a little by the end of the week, as news cycles always do, but on the following Thursday morning, something unexpected happened. Marcus was restocking bags at his register when Mr. Collins approached, holding a plain white envelope. "This came for you," he said, placing it on the counter. "No return address. Thought you should open it." Marcus wiped his hands on his apron and picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, a little heavier than normal, the flap sealed neatly. His name was written in careful block letters, no smudges, no flourishes. He slid a finger under the seal and pulled out a folded sheet of stationery. The first line was handwritten in blue ink, the letters steady but with just enough curve to suggest age. "You don't know who you helped that day," it began. Marcus's eyes moved slowly down the page. "It was my mother's birthday. She is Margaret, the woman you helped. She has spent her entire life giving to others, but she has rarely been on the receiving end. Last week, she told me she had never felt so embarrassed until you reminded her that she still matters. You showed her that her kindness all those years ago was not forgotten." He swallowed hard, the store noise fading around him as he read on. "Thank you for being the kind of young man I hope my own son grows up to be. Please accept this small token, not as payment, but as a gesture of gratitude. And if you ever decide to attend college, I would like to help with your expenses." Tucked inside the fold of the letter was a crisp $100 gift card to a local bank. Marcus turned it over in his hands, the weight of it suddenly heavier than the number printed on the front. He stood there for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly between his fingers. In the hum of the grocery store, with carts rattling past and scanners beeping steadily, it felt as though he had stepped out of the usual rhythm of the day, into something still and private. He read the letter again, slower this time, letting each word settle. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a quiet affirmation, as if the choice he had made without thinking, just acting on instinct, had reached farther than he ever could have planned. When he finally folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, he noticed his hands were warmer, his chest lighter. Mr. Collins was still nearby, stocking gum at the impulse buy rack, and gave him a questioning look. Marcus only nodded once, a small smile touching his mouth. The envelope went into the inside pocket of his coat, where he knew it would stay for a long time, a reminder of a winter morning when a can of soup, a dollar bill, and a choice made in silence, had turned into something much larger than the walls of Maple and Company could hold. Life settled back into its quiet rhythm after the letter, though Marcus carried it with him in the inside pocket of his coat, like a secret worth guarding. He kept working his shifts at Maple and Company, showing up early, bagging groceries with the same steady hands, greeting customers with the same calm warmth. The story still floated around town, but Marcus never mentioned it unless someone asked directly, and even then he would shrug, saying only that his grandmother had raised him to help if he could. There were no interviews, no speeches, no social media posts. He seemed almost relieved to let the noise fade. One Saturday morning, the bell above the store door chimed, and in walked Margaret alongside a woman Marcus knew instantly, his grandmother Lorraine. They had met for the first time a week earlier when Margaret had stopped by the apartment to deliver a handwritten thank you note in person. That visit had stretched into an afternoon of tea at the kitchen table, the two women trading stories of their younger years as though they had always known each other. Now they came through the store side by side, their coats buttoned tight against the cold, both carrying small reusable bags. Marcus watched them from the register as they moved down the aisles, chatting and laughing quietly over the produce, pausing together to compare the ripeness of tomatoes. It struck him how natural it looked, as though the morning had always been meant for the three of them to share, Marcus at his post, and the two women who had shaped his understanding of kindness, walking together in easy companionship. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected began to grow in the neighborhood. The story of the missing 85 cents had planted itself in people's minds, and it started showing up in small ways. A retired bus driver in the community group proposed an idea. What if we all carried at least 85 cents with us, just in case we could use it to help someone? Others liked the thought, and soon a few neighbors began calling it 85 cents of kindness. Within a month, it wasn't just a Facebook thing. People in the community center talked about it, teachers mentioned it to their students, and more than once Marcus saw strangers at the store quietly covering a few coins or $1 for the person ahead of them. No fanfare, no expectation, just a nod, a smile, and the small satisfaction of having made someone's day lighter. On a late winter afternoon, as Marcus was bagging groceries for a young father with his daughter, he caught sight of a woman in line counting coins from her purse. She was short by a quarter. Before Marcus could even react, the man standing behind her gently reached forward, placing the coin on the counter without a word. The woman looked up, startled, then smiled in a way that seemed to reach her eyes. Marcus didn't say anything, but a quiet warmth spread through him as he realized the ripple had moved beyond him. The kindness had found its own way forward. Weeks later, Margaret and Lorraine stopped by the store again. They lingered at his register, teasing him about how quiet he was even when the whole town seemed to know his name. Marcus smiled, shaking his head, feeling that familiar mix of humility and quiet pride. The bell over the door chimed behind them, letting in a gust of cold air and the faint smell of snow. And then as the line moved and the rhythm of the store carried on, Marcus found himself thinking about how much could turn on something as small as a handful of coins and a decision made in silence. His eyes traveled over the customers waiting, each one carrying their own stories, their own unseen burdens. So I ask you, next time you see someone counting out their coins in front of you, will you stand still, or will you be the reason they smile for the rest of their day?
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.